We have a great, gonna have a really interesting lecture today. Sharon Johnston is here from California, and we were just talking a few minutes ago, and I was telling Sharon that I'd been following their work for a while now, but in the last probably year or so, they've been getting a lot of publicity because of the project that they got for the Menil collection in Houston. And I've been looking at the work much more carefully recently, and I've actually been just, it's stunning how, I was trying to figure out how to describe this, how deceptively simple the work that they do is. They started their career doing smaller projects, doing a lot of houses. In particular, there's a house that they finished a few years ago called the Vault House. And I would encourage everybody, I'm sure that you're going to show that tonight, but I would encourage everybody to really look carefully at this house, as with all the work, but just look at the precision and thoughtfulness and what's accomplished with so few moves. There's a kind of an economy of means with how they execute their work, which is incredibly refreshing, incredibly sophisticated, and just very important, I think, at this particular time. For those of you who don't know the Menil collection in Houston, it's a campus of buildings in the middle of Houston, a collection of art, several buildings. One of the first buildings that was built at that place was by Renzo Piano, I think in the early 80s. It was one of his first projects in the United States. And at that point, he was really just known for the Pompidou Center. So it was a complete kind of transformation of his career toward the work that we kind of know of his work today. There was a competition to do another building as part of this campus about 4 or 5 years ago. A short list was put together that included Sana, included David Chipperfield, it included Tatiana Bilbao, and included Johnston and Marklee. And Sharon and her team won that competition. And that was a big deal. I mean, to beat out Sana, to beat out Chipperfield, in a place like this that has this incredible architectural legacy of buildings, it was a really big deal. And I think it was a transformative project in their career. It kind of was a shift from a certain scale of work up into another scale of work. And I think Sharon will certainly show that project tonight. It's under construction now, but it is a phenomenal project. I think it's going to be a project that's probably talked about in 10 years or so as much as Renzo Piano's building has been talked about. I think it's one of his better buildings, honestly, one of the first ones, but it's one of his better buildings. So anyway, it's a real pleasure to have Sharon here talking at Georgia Tech at this kind of transformative period in the trajectory of their career. So with that, Sharon, welcome.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me? Yeah, great. So it's great to be here. I haven't been to Atlanta for a really long time. I came right after I graduated from the GSD to visit Mac. Mac was the chair of the Graduate School of Design when I was there, and so it's really special to be back here and have Mac here to keep him up to speed on what I've actually been doing for the past 20 years. So anyway, thank you, Scott, for the invitation. It's great to have. Thanks for coming, all of you busy students. So tonight I wanted to, or this afternoon, share a selection of work that isn't necessarily organized chronologically, but has to do with kind of issues of scale and transformations of scale in our work. And I wanted to start by sharing a couple of images, where I should point this thing. It seems to be very frozen. Yeah, I just tried. Okay, thanks.
Clicker might work.
Okay. So anyway, this is a collection of images from a portfolio of work. It's sort of an ongoing set of images that we create around our work. That this is part of a portfolio that is currently on view in Chicago at the Architecture Biennial. And this selection, I think, says a lot about it, kind of by way of introduction, about sort of themes and preoccupations that we have in our work. These are both, I think, reveal something about our process and also our interest in representation in the work, as well as, I think, revealing our interest in the lineage of our work. We're sort of obsessed with understanding our work in the context of history as a way to sort of project into the future. And so this kind of practice helps us kind of test and distill ideas, and by kind of displacing works in progress or completed works into these situations that some of you may find clues to orient yourself in, are part of that sort of critical dialogue that we try to set up in our practice within our team, and also bringing in collaborators, oftentimes artists and things. And also, I think these images reflect our interest and kind of ongoing engagement with contemporary art. We have been working with artists since the very beginning of our practice in a whole host of ways, as collaborators, as clients. And I think that interest, even when we were in graduate school, we probably spent as much time in the art history department as we did in the architecture school. And I think for us, there's a couple key set of interests that inform our work as architects related to our engagement with artists. And that has to do with a real interest in the idea of, on the one hand, being in place, producing very tangible objects, buildings, but also having works that have a certain level of kind of formal autonomy, and that sort of tension between engagement, embeddedness, and autonomy is important to us in the work. And as well, I think a real preoccupation with history and the sort of core issues that define the discipline. I think at the same time, we are really obsessed with how to build. When we started our practice, no building was too small if it just gave us a chance to build. And so that tension between kind of historical precedent and the concrete realities of building are what really drive us as architects. And I think also, maybe finally, these images reflect for us a kind of quality of coherence. Scott was talking about a sort of a little bit hard to define quality of maybe abstraction or reduction in the work. And we like to talk about it as a kind of quality of coherence, where our process is really about a kind of beginning with a kind of abundance of complexity of inputs, that we don't think of it as a kind of reductive or minimalist approach, but really about a kind of alignment of conditions. Approximation is a term we use a lot to sort of move towards issues, let's say, of typology or kind of tectonic principles. We sort of start with a kind of complex set of inputs and move towards a more distilled or sort of synthetic solution. And so maybe just a few things about the practice to help you situate the scale of work we're engaged with. We are based in LA. We're about 25 designers and architects, and together with my partner Marklee, we run the office. And we, like most LA architects starting out, we work, of course, on we started with a lot of really small house projects. And I think, over the course of actually almost 17 years of having the practice, what probably unifies this work, it's situated all across the US at this point. We're working in Asia and South America, is a kind of conceptual approach to the work. So we're looking for ways to kind of find paradigmatic problems in our practice, like building on a hill, a sort of ubiquitous problem in Los Angeles, but looking for ways to kind of define it in a kind of contemporary way, according to contemporary parameters. Or the suburban house in a project in Argentina, working in China, engaging the sort of rapid challenges of construction and kind of programmatic transformation in cities like Shanghai, or in really historic places, for example, in Poggiogolo in Italy. And so questions about sightedness, the notions of place, they're really diverse. And so we look for these kind of paradigms as a way to anchor our work and kind of ground the set of questions that we try to focus on in each project. So we're based in LA. We do about maybe 30% of our work is there, and then we're really kind of working across the US at this point. And so it has given us the chance to start engaging different climates and different project conditions. And so I wanted to start tonight with an early project. It's called the Hill House, and it's in Southern California, very close to the Eames house, which is just right in this neighborhood. And it's one of those kind of properties that nobody in their right mind would really want to try to build a house on. It's probably like a 55% slope, almost unbuildable. And when you build on hillsides in Los Angeles, you get these sort of massive volumes of codes and regulations, which are completely uninspiring and look like that, kind of diagrams. And so we decided we wanted to take a different approach, which inspired, for example, by Hugh Ferris, where we wanted to think about sort of sculpting a volume on this hillside by looking at it in a kind of relational way, instead of sort of plopping a building on it that could kind of be anywhere. So we began to sort of project in a very literal and straightforward way the conditions of the hill. And our mandate, of course, by our client was we need to make the biggest house we possibly can. So in addition to volume, we were looking at kind of problems of structure, building on the hillside, shedding water, getting access for the car, and resulted in a figure like this. And so there's a kind of real specificity about the form, yet it comes from a sort of very diverse set of inputs that are somehow outside of the site at the same time. So we end with a resulting sort of buildable envelope and then begin to transform and shape the interior volume. So it was a sort of inside out and outside in kind of project. We got really excited about this sort of method that we invented for what we thought creating a real sort of efficiency and opportunity for building on hillsides like this canyon in LA. And so we produced this sort of proto-master plan and showed it to the planners that were so difficult and mean in giving us approval. And we thought they would be excited, but they weren't that entertained, but they did end up giving us a building permit. So we struggle with these things in Los Angeles. So just a few model shots of the project that I think reflect some of our interests in, I was talking about coherence in the work, and a lot of times that comes from contrasting conditions. So for example, minimizing the footprint of the building on the site due to the cost of the foundation, but maximizing volume. Maximizing aperture sizes, but eliminating them where they're not appropriate. And so the project kind of has that kind of dualism about it. It was really conceived in a very three-dimensional way, and so it's clad with a material called grail coat, so that all the horizontal, vertical, and inclined planes are the same material. And that for us was important to sort of reflect this kind of totality in the way that we thought about the object and the porosity between the inside and the outside of the house. And in this case, it's a kind of light lavender color that we worked with an artist. His name is Jack Pearson. Once we designed this building, we were sort of completely perplexed as to what color it should be. And so Jack worked with us, and we studied the surrounding landscape. So this lavender is really sort of chameleon-like and reflects the surrounding eucalyptus trees. And so in contrast to the exterior, it's very volumetric and sort of without sort of structure and mass on the inside. And so this is the middle floor, the entry level. And then from below, you get a sense of the sort of massiveness of the building. This wall is an inclined wall at about 45 degrees, so it's perpendicular to the slope. And according to our structural engineer, this was the hardest shoring project and engineering problem he'd ever had to take on. So we feel proud of this wall. The house is very close to the Eames house, so we were, of course, very sensitive about how to express the structure in the building. And given current codes and sizes of members that we had to incorporate into the house, the only visible structure that you see is this stair element, which forms the main central core of the house. So this is one piece of steel, and then the stair, which is hung from the main core of the building. So it's cantilevered on either side, and then stabilized in the center with this steel frame. So 10 years later, we finished last year another hillside house, and even in 10 years, the hillside ordinances in Los Angeles are rapidly changing due to greedy developers. So we were even much more restricted in this project than we were in the Hill House. And so in this case, we had to completely preserve this entire hillside and shore it at the top. And then we had a kind of, despite this is about a little bit less than an acre of land, we were only able to build about 5,000 square feet. And so the approach to sort of embedding the house in the site was to take this very simple object and just bend it along the site to create that frame for the landscape in front of it. And then within that sort of almost pure object, all of the volumes that are shaped within the house to envelop the mechanical, bathrooms and sort of infrastructure of the house are within these sort of sculptural elements that absorb those services and allow us to kind of maintain this purity of a kind of inside-outside house. So the two bends in the form, one is on the east side at the entry, and then the other on the west, just to engage it with the slope. It's a cast-in-place concrete house, so it's very thermally. The thermal mass of the house was critical to the sort of performance of the building, and then on the opposite side, it's all open, and a set of operable louvers are automated for sun and wind and such. So from below, this again, a kind of significantly steep hillside, you really perceive this is one of the gardens, so they're sort of constantly moving up and down the hill, I think is a kind of strong view of how that curve works with the site. And then on the interior, it gives you kind of sense of the kind of inside-outside quality and the way that the service spaces, the poché space envelops and also becomes a kind of reflector for light. These are a pretty significant engineering feat for these windows. It's about 16 feet. They're 5 feet by 16 feet, and it was it's a structural glass system, and so that we would be able to achieve this kind of purity of inside-outside. So that was really, essentially the diagram of the house. And then these are some of the skylights that are part of that service kind of ribbon that wraps throughout the levels of the house, and also engages skylights that allow us to sort of baffle light and get a kind of evenness on the east and west side. Or the upstairs bathroom that is within that sort of poché of the two walls. This next project is in Rosario in Argentina, and it was a colleague who's also beginning to do some development in Argentina, and this was a transformation of a historic horse farm. And so it really, despite how it looks in this image, we took it on as a kind of suburban house type and became sort of obsessed with how we could begin to, despite being one of the first people to build there, begin to anticipate what would happen in the future with additional homes surrounding this building, and took on the idea of the sort of promenade and the idea of moving through the house in the way that apertures could both engage the landscape, of course, do all the environmental work they needed to do, but also work in concert with opaque walls to begin to kind of mask and create a new landscape of interior space that would also create more privacy inside the house. There was sort of a lot of restrictions about what we could build on this property, as well as very rural and kind of primitive builders. And so we needed to think in a very basic way both about the form and the method of constructing the house. So we started with a very kind of primitive geometry, and then to accommodate some of the volumetric restrictions and interests in light and structure, we took a very simple approach of slicing a series of planar cuts out of this very basic form, as well as a series of spherical slices out of the building. We knew that these concrete builders could build domes for churches, and so they were very comfortable with this kind of geometry despite its maybe apparent complexity. And so the result of this house was that there's never really a sense of the front. As you approach it and move around it, you're sort of always put in motion around the building, and that was important for us to kind of offset the typical types of planning problems, especially in Southern California, we're faced with of front yards and rear yards and sort of expectations of how you would occupy a property like this. So it's a cast-in-place concrete building, and it always this kind of relationship you see here of an aperture and a kind of cut here or above it is part of the kind of syntax of how we develop the building. And oftentimes, in addition, what we look for are sort of moments of sort of maximum tension where many structural forces are coming together from the roof and this plane. We introduce a kind of a void in the form of an aperture, a skylight, so that we use the kind of intersection of a kind of atmospheric light condition with where you would expect a lot of structure. I think it gives it a kind of lightness that contrasts with the weight of the house. So I'll just take you through a couple of images that gives you a sense of how the mass sits on the property, and then also similar perhaps to the two earlier houses that I just showed you, I think there's a kind of sense of mass on the exterior that's contrasted with a kind of interest in volume and light on the interior. And so here's a diagram looking at the way we thought about the apertures, always in partnership with one of these sculpted planes. So they become not only part of the structure and the form of the house, but also a kind of surface that light reflects on in partnership, in kind of conjunction with each window. So they sort of have many roles to play. And finally, you circulate through the house. It's about 3,500 square feet, and then it culminates in a rooftop terrace. So you exit out this door and up these stairs, and there's a sort of way that the sky gets framed as you move up, as moving along the sloping slice of the wall, and then you have this sort of panoramic view at the top. This project was kind of controversial in a way when it was finished, and there was a lot of bloggers they're giving us their input, and one of our favorites was that it was the love child of Mario Botta and a septic tank. So we like that. But we like this image as well because it shows, I think, our interest in how the sort of atmosphere that surrounds each building. So at night, the house has a very different sort of sense of porosity and lightness than perhaps during the day. So there's always a kind of interest in a sort of transformative quality to the buildings. So this is the Vault House, the project that Scott mentioned. And for us, for architects in Southern California, the Beach House, of course, is the coveted project. There isn't many beachfront properties to build on, and so it was a pretty exciting opportunity. This one is in near Oxnard in Santa Barbara. So it was a kind of unique lot because it's very narrow, and it had a sort of unique kind of zoning offset. So we were able to stick out about 15 feet past our neighbor. So that became kind of provocative and interesting. And essentially how we approached this project was most projects on beaches, at least in Southern California, are very long and narrow. And so the rooms at the front of the building are super, and then everything else behind it could kind of be anywhere. They're dark and damp and not very inviting. And so we decided to kind of take that on by introducing a void pretty much in the center of the buildable envelope of the house in the form of a courtyard. And so that that sort of inverted a lot of expectations of how you would plan a beachfront house like this. So the building is 140 feet long and about 35 feet wide. And the kind of basic brief of our clients, a couple, their daughters were in college, so they were still a close family, but they wanted to have rooms for them, but they weren't there all the time. And so we were looking for an approach to deal with this extreme length that would treat the building much more almost like a kind of kaleidoscope or something where the visibility of the beach was drawn all the way through the building. And so we needed to find a form that would allow us, in the way that we could align all those rooms, that would give us that transparency. And we landed on this form of the vault. So it's a kind of integer of space. They're all essentially follow, the profiles are different, but the kind of logic of the room is the same in all cases. So this is simply taking the maximum buildable envelope and then inserting all the rooms that we needed to accommodate the program. And what ends up happening is that there's essentially almost no circulation spaces except for the stair. It's just a series of rooms, and when all the doors and windows are open, it's completely transparent all the way through. And so here's a series of sections from the most westerly section at the beach, where it's lifted off the ground because it's in a tsunami zone, and going back, kitchen and master bedroom on the second floor, the courtyard, the library, and then the girls' bedrooms and the garage. And so this diagram captures this interest we had in drawing that view all the way through the house. And so it really is like a kind of shutter that opens and closes depending on the day and their use of the house. And so this is a model shot, gives you that sense of, first of all, the idea of the base is important. All these homes, you guys see this now all over the country, really the problem of building at the ocean front and lifting the house off the ground. And we always feel that space is sort of underthought. And so we tried to employ the structural ideas we had about the vault and the frame, even in the foundation. So this is, we had the restriction to lift the house off above the mean high tide line a certain distance. And then we sculpt this space underneath, and that is also the structural and formal logic of the occupiable rooms as well. And I think as a kind of method, the way we developed the project was that we were sort of agnostic in a way about how the development of the vaults and their intersections would work. And so in some cases, like perhaps here, we were sort of interested, this is from the master bedroom, we like the sort of way that the vault of the room is occluded by the vault of the living room. There's a sort of slight misalignment that provides intimacy for the master bedroom, but still aligns, and then maybe in contrast to some maybe slightly more uncomfortable intersections where we almost get a kind of Gothic vault. But we felt like the process to play itself out needed to just accept those differences and kind of produce a more complex language through the variation. So I think another important clue for us that in a way sort of inspired the vault was that this is in Oxnard. It's a largely kind of tradition of Spanish architecture in this neighborhood of different vintages and qualities, but part of what we were also interested in was sort of engaging that historical legacy. So the arch is, you know, a nod to that, but I think what transforms it for us is that it's actually a volume. It's not simply a motif. And then certain things like the asymmetry of this elevation or the way that we carve out a portion of a vault as a negative space to provide circulation into the courtyard, which is the main entry point for the house. And then the opposite view from the beach, where the house is much more transparent, I think reflects the kind of transformation that happens through the house. So here's all of those elevations compiled together. And this is the finished house. This building is also clad in that same material grail coat because it's a marine climate. It's really an extreme condition in terms of maintaining the house. So by eliminating all the kind of metals and joints and details of the envelope, we're able to, you know, almost treat it more like a boat than a building. So this is the south elevation, and this is that entry. So eventually there will be, probably, we're anticipating a house on this parcel, but for now it's empty. And so by carving away that negative space, you create a more generous entry, and then you come up these stairs into a courtyard. So that's the main point of entry into the house for guests. And this space is incredibly important for us in terms of the planning of the house, the importance of light, bringing light into the depth of the building, but it's become a really key place for the owners of the house because it's a kind of respite. It's an incredibly windy, oftentimes cold beach climate, and so this is a kind of place of stillness and light. It's sort of an abstract kind of a void space. And so here you're looking east towards the beach, and then this is the opposite view looking west towards the ocean. This is not our design. This is some of their illustrious art collection, but this is in the living room. I think gives you a sense of that volume in the space that is contrasted. This is the same position, but looking the opposite way. And so one of the things that was a big fight for us was typically everybody puts master private rooms right here, and so they have a great view, as maybe the living room does, but the rest of the house, as I said, is often dark. So by creating this sectional offset, so the kitchen is here, double height living space, and then the master is above, we're able to kind of bring that depth of view and light all the way much deeper into the house. I think the treatment of apertures is a kind of key part of a lot of our work. It's of course about light and view, but it also plays this kind of strong role in the way that we develop the structural diagrams for the house. And so often in places where you would expect a lot of structure, we go through a lot of effort to create openings, often because they're a good place for view or sources of light, but to create a kind of complexity in how the volume is experienced. And this particular window then has a kind of depth that becomes a room in a way that is maybe different than where the envelope is much thinner. So just take you through a couple of views. This is from the master bedroom. This is now across the courtyard from the library study, and then back out from the ocean. This next series of projects is we look at kind of the singular object now, begin to look at where the objects start to multiply. It's not all of these projects are much bigger than what you've seen, but there's a kind of proto-urban quality to them. And this project was our contribution to what was called the Ordos 100. It was initiated in 2008 by the Chinese artist Ai Weiwei, and he had been commissioned to do a kind of arts complex, part of which was finished. And then, it was a sort of some kind of weird black deal with the Chinese government and Ordos. But the idea was to create a kind of cultural enclave that included a residential development. And so 100 relatively young architects from around the world were shipped to Ordos in Western China, and we each received a commission to design a house in this master plan that Weiwei had created. And so for us, it did have a kind of inherent or latent urbanism to it, and we took the project on in that way. This is an image of a exhibition of Weiwei's at Kunsthaus Bregenz, and this is a model that he created of a site, and this is our project. And so, you can see even from this image that we anticipated all of these architects would, it would be their chance to big international showcase. And so our approach to the project was actually to sort of go into a much more primitive thinking about what it means to design a house. And this kind of megaron shape was what we developed as a kind of primitive and then multiplied it. We call this project House because we believed both in terms of its scale, it's a 10,000 square foot building, which is immense by Chinese standards, and the idea of it being part of this community, that it really, we imagined it almost as a kind of urban response. And so part of the way we further developed that was how we sited the building on the property by kind of breaking a little bit of Weiwei's rules on the siting. You always approach it from a kind of oblique, and so this doubleness is somehow always present, but it's never the same view. And that was something that was important to us, both kind of formally, but tectonically, and in terms of how the house was occupied on the interior. So the only guidelines that we were given by Weiwei and our client was that it had to be a cast-in-place building, a concrete building, and that it was clad in brick. And so, pretty basic structural principles. But for us, it was interesting. It's a very extreme climate, so it's very cold and very hot. And so part of kind of coming up with an environmental response was thinking a lot about apertures, about this sort of middle space of the porch as a kind of in-between space. And then to try to offset the kind of immense scale of the building, thinking about how to address the openings in the facade to sort of offset the weight and mass of the building by sort of interrupting what you would be expected load pass and sort of engaging the perimeter of the building through the openings and kind of offsetting what your expectations of where structure should be. And then, of course, the size and scale of the apertures was a key part of giving life to the inside of this house because of its size. And then it was all organized around a kind of thermal chimney that connected all 4 floors and allowed for light and air evacuation out the center of the house. 1 or 2 of these buildings were started construction that were sort of outside of the 100, and then our illustrious client, I think, got into some bad deal with his government representative, and the project never went ahead. But it was actually a really important project for us because it was the beginning of a long-term set of collaborations with architects from around the world. And I think it's a little bit unique, I would say, to our generation that we tend to be involved in a lot of collective projects where we're part of many maybe groups of architects where our colleagues are able to curate these groups. And I think it's been a really fulfilling, of course, professional opportunities to build around the world, but it's also produced a kind of discourse with these architects that we get to teach with and do projects with that I think is really important. And for a lot of you in school, I think it's really important to remember who you're in school with and build those relationships, because it's been a really vital part of our practice in the last, let's say, 10 years. And so I think this image gives you a sense of how we tried to treat the interior, and again, sort of occupying the interior maybe in an unexpected way with larger volumes, but then as you get higher into the house, into the more private spaces, the kind of tight fit of program and volume or form of the house becomes more engaged, let's say in this space, which is the master suite at the top. So this is a project that's just finishing construction in Los Angeles, and it is on the estate of a really kind of significant architectural home by an architect named Paul Williams, a very accomplished African-American architect in Los Angeles, really beloved by people of all generations. And so our client is a collector and has lived in this house on and off since he was a boy. And so he was really committed to He has a big art collection, and he wanted to create more space, but not sort of interrupt the kind of history of the house. And so for us, we took over a parcel on a slope lot, and I think this idea of the double house that was somehow inherent in the Ordos project is also evident here, that reflects conditions of the program, but also acknowledges a kind of latent language of the Paul Williams House in the new building. And so the doubleness is not always revealed. It has a kind of singularity that sets up an expectation of a kind of axial, very formal kind of building from this west entrance, as opposed to the east side, which has a kind of muted, almost very inconspicuous definition to it. And then the building is clad in a kind of muted zinc coated copper, and so it also in its materiality is very, in a way, sort of low luster and sort of more abstract than defined through its materiality and its detailing. And so the doubleness then kind of played out in terms of the program, that it is 2 galleries plus a couple other ancillary spaces, and their proportion are very different despite the sort of seemingly repetitive doubleness of the building from the exterior. So there's this kind of drawing gallery and then a big painting gallery, and sort of all of this is then unified by a kind of sophisticated skylight approach, which wasn't revealed in the models, which conceals all the sort of sources of light, but creates a kind of unifying atmosphere despite the difference in scale of the rooms. So this is the low-level gallery, light-level gallery in the back, and the drawing gallery, and then the large painting gallery. So it's about finished. It'll finish in probably December. I think in Southern California, we've also have the chance to engage some significant historic properties. In this case, Richard Neutra's Sten house, which was finished in the early 1950s. And so he had just come from Europe. He'd come out of Mendelssohn's office, and the piano curve was still a part of his sort of architectural language. And this house is most famous for this kind of beautiful sunroom. And so we were asked, a film director owns this house, and we were asked to create a kind of ancillary building for his writing studio and support spaces. And so we were interested in how to think about this problem of the double, but in this case, sort of engaging the kind of formal language of Neutra, but transforming it according to kind of the contemporary problem of the program, issues of structure, and environmental performance in the house. And so here's an image of the model. And these are, I think, so for example, where Neutra deals with the kind of the box and the ribbon window, we're treating the aperture much more as a kind of punch window for privacy. And this is the lower level of the building has apartments for his guest collaborators. So it's sort of many different uses in one, and somehow we're trying to both engage all of those, but kind of conceal the differences in the kinds of uses of the different rooms. So this project will also finish in probably the next 4 or 5 months. So this is a project in Chile, and related to my comment about the kind of collaboration that came out of the Ordos project. This project was a group of 10 architects from around the world were selected as part of a government initiative after the 2010 earthquake in the Biobío region of Chile along the coast. And our parcel is in a town called Penco. And so the idea was, it was kind of a radical thing in that they set aside a certain amount of money for cultural infrastructure. And typically, first response funds are going to housing to replenish destroyed houses. But in this case, we were able to commission a small pot of money in each of these cities to build this community center. And our project was sitting in this beautiful pine forest overlooking this bay of Penco. And so for us, it was both a kind of commemorative project. This was a pretty tragic event in the history of Chile, although they're quite used to earthquakes. And so we took on it's about a 3,000 square foot program brief. And our approach to it was to both accommodate the program, which was this interior multifunctional hall, but also double the size of the space, as any good architect should try to do, and create an outdoor courtyard. So that the idea was that you would enter into the space, a space that's open to the sky, as a kind of respite space, a contemplative space before you enter the hall. And we were inspired a lot by this kind of beautiful sweeping bay as a way to, and attempted to think about the kind of formal orientation of the building to echo that as this kind of not oriented, continuous kind of volume. So this is the diagram of our thoughts about the courtyard. So you first enter a space that's oriented vertically towards the sky and the canopy of pine trees, and then entering into the hall and having the horizontal orientation of the window to the ocean. The building is then clad, sort of conceals itself much more, almost like a bunker in that sense. So it's just simply, we create these two elliptical forms and then inscribe the perimeter that kind of engages their tangent corners, and that becomes the service space, the poché services. And so together, the building has kind of equal outside and inside space. And then this is a kind of important axis where you enter the building right on this corner. There's sort of one moment where you have this kind of through line view when you enter into through the interior space and back out, which is this view here. I think for us, kind of conceptually, this project is really about just simply inscribing a space between the ground and the sky. And we're pretty excited that the ultimate client for this project is going to be a local dance troupe. And so we're confident that both these outdoor spaces, as well as the indoor studios and the landscape around, will be suitable for them. And so this kind of almost the most minimal amount of boundary condition that we could create seems, really appropriate for this dance group. I think also, despite its seemingly monolithicness from the exterior, the kind of simple curve of the wall and the way it engages the sun really animates this space. So it's that kind of coming together of very kind of basic and primitive conditions that is how we approach, especially these kinds of projects that are very low budget and very kind of basic in terms of their execution. And for the kind of sculpting of that outside courtyard, we're using a trunk from one of the pine trees that we do have to cut down to sculpt the sort of scalloped edges of that wall of the exterior courtyard. And then on the interior, it's a cast-in-place building, and we use a kind of very basic technique of just slightly polishing the concrete wall, and so that our intention is to kind of bring that sweeping view and have it reflect along the perimeter of the interior of the building and sort of create this sort of new kind of total volume between inside and out. And so this is just a model shot giving you a sense of that kind of atmosphere. So this project is, again, part of a group project. This was completed for the 2013 Shanghai Westbund Biennial in Shanghai. And again, kind of similar in a sense that the planners of this this is the Bund. And so the center of Shanghai is here. And there's a very large development of housing in this part of the site. And the idea was that they would first start with the biennial to bring a set of cultural programs to the site, and that would sort of initiate an interest in this new redevelopment. But given that and the sort of unknowns of that, we literally had kind of no brief for this project. And so the project is entitled The Pavilion of Six Views, and we took a kind of literal approach to the problem of sort of no program, which was to create a sort of modular kind of integer that we could repeat and create a sort of diversity of spaces that could accommodate a lot of different uses over time. So 3 of the pavilions are faced outwards, so they really engage the city. It sits on a kind of interesting triangular parcel, and then 3 are oriented inwards. And so the way the plan works, that they sort of nest and oscillate between this kind of communal set of rooms that are connected on the interior of the space around a courtyard and the outwardly oriented pavilions that look out to the city. I think for us, it was trying to kind of approximate, on the one hand, the kind of history of this industrial landscape. Many of the kind of great halls that are in this site will be preserved and transformed, and then many other buildings will be torn down. And so we were trying to operate somehow between this sort of art pavilion scale, this precious building in a way, and the sort of rawness of this industrial landscape. So the idea was that that the building is sort of both turning inward and outward at the same time, and then the moments where they meet is where you would enter the building. And so each gallery has a view out and then a second source of light, which is sort of at the apex of the curve. So this kind of balance of light is a critical part of all of our work, and I think kind of animates the maybe seemingly abstract formal resolution of the work through the kind of changing qualities of light. And then the inner volumes are connected, except for they sort of pinch around this courtyard. So the kind of atmosphere is very different on the inside of the 3 interior pavilions. Recently, last year, this building was adopted by the Shanghai International Center for Photography. So it's now a museum for photography. Before we developed the project that was built, we also sort of looked at it, and I think this kind of scared our Chinese clients, but the idea was to think about it really as a tower, and so this kind of seriality was multiplied in the section, and it was a media gallery, and we were interested in the way that the sort of alignments and misalignments of structure and aperture could produce this seemingly unstable, but actually really solid tower structure. Sorry. So that was that scheme. They felt they couldn't accomplish it in the time they had, so we went with the scheme that was built. And then this last series of projects are, kind of shifts in scale in our work. And I think maybe it's kind of interesting to note that I think a lot of young architects in America struggle with moving from the kind of small scale house to a larger scale institutional projects. And it always comes down to how much experience do you have. And a strategy that Mark and I took to just try to kind of leapfrog that was go east. So we went to Europe. We had a lot of friends and colleagues in Europe that were involved in the arts, and this was a master planning project that we commissioned for an art foundation called Depart Foundation, who had developed a partnership with the city. So this is in Italy. This is a town called Grottaferrata, which is south of Rome. It's a little bit famous. This is a monastery where the Da Vinci Codex, it's a paper restoring monastery, so the Da Vinci Codex was restored here. And so this parcel was going to be developed so that this large park would be deeded back to the city, and our clients would develop a sort of mixed-use residential and commercial property. And it was interesting because it had buildings of very different eras, from a 19th century villa, an abandoned sort of mid-20th century office building, an old hotel, and then a kind of really beautiful series of carriage houses that form a kind of medieval street right adjacent to this villa. And so our problem was we're building about 100,000 square feet, or we were planning for that. And so we wanted to think about an architectural language that could accommodate the diversity of program, from galleries to housing to commercial office building, and be flexible yet have a kind of coherence as a whole. So we took a very basic kind of approach of this building block idea that allowed us to then become specific and programmatic and site specific through the way that they would aggregate, whether it sort of was about forming a courtyard or stacking or creating these sort of ring structures that could stack. So this is just a kind of overview of the master plan of the project. So, art spaces are sort of scattered throughout the park, creative office, housing, this is here, and then this gallery. So just looking a little bit more closely at a couple of the buildings, the gallery is adjacent to this kind of street, like this medieval carriage house street. And so the idea was to maintain that scale of the street-like atmosphere and then create a courtyard. So the program was that it could be a place for a number of single artists to have workshops, or it could be a more formal kind of museum kind of program. And so this kind of aggregation both needed to accommodate very different programs in each pavilion, but also have a sense of coherence. So by sculpting the roof, by sort of taking one singular cut across all of the volumes, we were able to create a sense of coherence and sort of totality of the building, but allow it to have this sort of ad hocness about a number of series of different volumes. Or alternatively, in the creative office building, really a building in the round, so a very different kind of urban building and a different scale of building. The approach was to create a series of volumes that formed rings that we would stack and offset and create a kind of central column of light and air in the center. And then it had a kind of flexibility that could allow artists to have studios there, but also have leasable space. So the way that apertures and structure worked was flexible and could accommodate sort of orientation, and it allowed us to then sort of address all the different buildings around it as a kind of building in the round, as opposed to a sort of front-back kind of proposition. And then the housing, taking the idea of the sort of primitive of the block and stacking it as a series of mini towers so that the rooftop became the ground. You entered at the roof, so we were able to give back the ground to the public park and have great views back to the city. And then you would descend down from the top into the more intimate parts of each tower. And it was a pretty interesting web of artist studios, so sort of not for profit real estate, and then different scales of apartments that were sort of nested into the block. This project it was a master planning project that we won with a group of architects. It's in a place called Amsouli in Switzerland. And it's big housing development. It was colleagues of ours, one that were finalists, Kristin Gantenbein, great architects that are just finishing the Kunsthaus Basel in Basel. And instead of taking it on, they're a size of office like ours, they invited a bunch of colleagues. So this is our project. Office from Belgium, Alejandro Olivena, Bow Wow, Tatiana was involved. This is her project with Derek Dellecamp. So it was a really interesting, we didn't collaborate on each one of our projects, but I think looking at this master plan, you have a sense of a kind of shared set of interests in architecture. And so ours was an interesting parcel because it was in the geographic center of the property, and it was also on top of, all the parking is below, and so a lot of people who didn't live in our building would be passing through it. So there was a kind of exceptional urbanism in the building. So, Lake Geneva is here. So it's sort of an incredible view down to the south. And so our approach was to maximize the perimeter of the building, because that's obviously where you want the view, and then create a series of very urban-like courtyards in the center of the building to provide access for the dwellers of our building, but also create a kind of dignified space for the public or other residents that would pass through the building, through voiding out these courtyards. So in a way, a kind of inverse or kind of inside-out planning idea where the perimeter is very continuous, and then the glimpses of the landscape and the lake were very select and sort of precisely calibrated in the public spaces. So it also, in addition to being the biggest building and having all the circulation happening up and down, it also sat in a really steep, or the steepest part of the site. And so beyond this sort of linking of courtyards, we employed the diagonal as a way to create a kind of autonomy for each one of these spaces, but also address the kind of section as you move through. So each space has both feels unto itself, but has a kind of sense of a collectiveness through the views through, these diagonal views through. This is just a view of, kind of gives you a sense of how it sits in the section of the site, and our attempt to create a kind of uniform condition on the perimeter for every unit, despite the different sizes of the units. So I think this somehow reflects this interest we have in creating a really wide range of parameters to do with site, structure, program, and then begin to massage them to sort of synthesize and create kind of a little bit more coherence in the project. So this is the second to last project, and this is a project that we developed a kind of initial schematic for and are now just starting the schematic design on. And it's for UCLA's Graduate Art Studios building. So it's not in the Westwood campus, but in a kind of historic industrial part of Los Angeles called the Hayden Track. Maybe you guys are familiar with the work of Eric Moss, and he's been really defining this area with a long-term relationship with a client of his. So UCLA has had this property since the mid-'80s, and so it's a real agglomeration of old warehouses, some of really great vintage and others that are really kind of throwaway. So our first effort in the sort of analysis with the faculty was to think about how much could we take away and what did we need to preserve to become the sort of DNA of the development of the project. And so essentially what we ended up with was preserving this historic wallpaper factory in this warehouse, and that became the sort of primitive, and so that building is lifted off the ground about 3 feet. So we extend that slab and create a new raised ground, so we have a kind of continuous ground to build the project, and then we expand the facade, so we inscribe the entire block. It's about a 55,000 square foot footprint. And then take the DNA of this very basic and kind of ubiquitous wood bow truss and develop that as the roof structure for this kind of sheltered but unconditioned perimeter space around the envelope of the site. So this is an early model looking at just the basic warehouse primitive and then the additional pieces. So the approach was that all the the studios for the students would be in the warehouse for the most part, and then these volumes would be the more public spaces for studio workshops, classrooms, gallery, artist in residence, gardens, and things like that. And that's with the roof on. So the approach to the project, to the point that we've developed it so far, was to try to think about this sort of industrial vernacular that's in a way kind of disappearing from Los Angeles, but ubiquitous here, and try to just begin to both understand it and transform it to create this new kind of more public scale to the campus. And so simple things like cantilevering this prefab wall to allow to pick up the structure of the truss of the roof, for example, allows us to just quietly transform it. I think one of the really key parts of collaborating with both the students and the faculty was an interest in a kind of underdetermined quality. I think Jude showed me your graduate studios that Nadera and Monica did, and we appreciated the kind of quality of approaching a creative space like a studio for architects or artists, and looking for a kind of underdetermined quality to the architecture. So it kind of does just enough to support the program, but allows the activities of the work in the building to be foregrounded. So I think this new roof is essentially just a kind of what we call a solar umbrella. So it doesn't enclose space, but creates essentially about 20,000 square feet of unconditioned but sheltered space. So all the outdoor workshops and so forth are underneath that roof, and then it also will be a sort of have a glowing quality to it. So it both gives identity to the school without sort of within the sort of language of the architecture. And so the basic kind of conceptual model in the end of the project is to think of the building as a kind of mini city. So all of these spaces, the pinup spaces of Center Bay, the arcade, the garden, the workshops become sort of public spaces that are all linked by these streets and circulation spaces. We're, as you probably saw from the introductory set of images, we're sort of obsessed with Mies, in particular, this kind of body of work, of this collage work. And this image was important for us, somehow thinking about the UCLA Graduate Studios building. But in fact, what we were actually interested in was sort of unpacking, thinking about those void spaces and trying to give primacy to the basic nature of the truss, the slab, the frame, as a way to kind of become the architectural language of the building. And this is the last project. Scott mentioned this is the Menil Drawing Institute. And so the project, when we were awarded the project, a master plan had been completed by David Chipperfield. And so this is the campus before we started construction. This is the Menil Collection building, Renzo's building. This is the Cy Twombly Pavilion. Rothko Chapel's up there. The Byzantine Chapel of Francois de Menil is here. And this was a large apartment complex that the Menils owned and was a big source of income for them. And so our project sits about right here. So when we inherited the project, this is a drawing from Chipperfield's master plan. All of the apartment complex is gone. This is the site of the Drawing Institute, and there is now in the works a new development along Richmond Avenue. So this is south and north, which will be a kind of income generator for the Menil and to offset the tearing down of the apartment building. And so what was important is that the Drawing Institute sits about in the geographic center of the Menil campus. It's about 30 acres, or 30 city blocks in total. And before Renzo was awarded the project, John and Dominique de Menil had commissioned Louis Kahn to do a building for them. And sadly, John de Menil died within, I think, about a year of their initial discussions, and Louis Kahn died right after that. But the importance of that collaboration, which is reflected here in this drawing, was the kind of definition by Dominique and John about the importance of art, exhibiting art, the idea of storage and art as being part of the same art experience. So maybe some of you are familiar with the idea of the treasure rooms at the Menil, and that came from these initial studies where they didn't think about the sort of white box museum and storage being something ancillary, but the idea of thinking about museum space and storage space together was what they initially began to think about even in this project with Louis Kahn. And so before Renzo was hired, John and Dominique commissioned Philip Johnson to build their house, their residence in Houston, and this is this building. And the story goes that they were interested in, they were asking people about who they should hire, and they were very interested in Mies van der Rohe, but apparently Philip would do the project for half the price. And so in the spirit of economy, Dominique chose Philip Johnson. And this house was finished just after the Glass House, so it was one of his first commissioned buildings, and it's a really vital part of the evolution of the Menil collection with Renzo, and as well our project. So I think for us, what's important, the Drawing Institute is about 30,000 square feet, so it's somewhere between this institutional scale and a domestic scale. And so the Menil is, kind of based on the mothership of the Menil collection and these satellite buildings. So it's really a neighborhood for art. It's not just a singular museum. And the spaces are defined primarily through the presence of light from above, from Renzo and all the subsequent buildings, Rothko, Flavin. That is what defines the experience of art at the Menil. And equally to us was the importance of these bungalows that make up the fabric of the campus. John and Dominique bought them all, they own almost all of them in this 30 block limit. And they're all painted the same color gray. And so there's a kind of interesting, almost surreal quality of, you're not quite sure if you're in a stage set or, if this is all one owner and they're rented out to for residential purposes as well as commercial tenants. And then finally, the sort of third key ingredient is the landscape, these great oak trees that punctuate the property and are really well cared for. So this is current condition, and this is the Drawing Institute. So we take away the apartment building, and our project is really organized around these gardens, these great trees that were left with the removal of the apartment building. And I think what's also key is the way that our building nests up within this sort of fabric of bungalows that define the campus, so very different than the sort of autonomy of the Menil Collection building. The kind of conceptual idea for the Drawing Institute was sort of creating this very thin folded plate of steel as a kind of shelter over the contents of the building. So it sort of nests underneath the canopy of trees and produces this kind of delicate frame that holds the volumes beneath it. As a basic diagram, these trees are some of the existing trees, so kind of as a basic planning principle, it was creating rooms around those trees which were key to modulating light for us. And then the building essentially just kind of fits in around those trees. So there's 3 central courtyards that define the space, the building, and then the program sort of fits in around that. And sort of as a conceptual diagram, the idea of sort of a series of small buildings under this great roof was how we developed the project, which is, it's called the Menil Drawing Institute, but it's really 3, is an exhibition gallery, a study center, and a conservation laboratory and archive. So these are just these 3 volumes, gallery, administration, study center, and conservation underneath this folded plate steel roof. So here's the diagram surrounded by the courtyards. And here's the roof that sort of nests all those things together and gives it a kind of wholeness. I think for those of you that have been to the Menil, movement in the campus is really key, and the idea of this sort of non-axial, almost meandering-like circulation is part of the magic of being there. And so for us, as we envisioned the Drawing Institute, at one level it was important that you could almost just pass through it but never enter the building. So the idea of the porch and the garden were really key as the kind of urban principles of the building and how it anchored itself in the site, because it's a relatively small building. And then from the very first competition stages, we were studying light, and part of the reason of stretching the building out, introducing the courtyards, was to modulate the light. So from here, which is 10,000 foot candles, to the gallery, which is 5, simply through the kind of form of the roofs, the extent of the roofs, we're able to naturally produce that sort of step down in light level without any sort of artificial means, and a pretty significant amount of transparency in the building. We've been working on this project. Our lighting designer is George Sexton, who's been an incredible partner, and also Michael van Valkenburg is the landscape architect. And I think you can see from this work that we worked really, really closely with Michael and his team, because the sort of atmosphere of the garden and the literal shade of the garden was a key part of all of our calculations for light in the project. So this is a view from the south where the building feels quite mute. It's almost simply a porch to the garden to the south. And then here is the kind of a new green that we're forming. This is the Twombly building, which was never really visible from the south before. We're relocating the energy house, and we are designing the new energy house, which is actually here. So we create this new space that's anchored on the east by the west courtyard of the Drawing Institute. So you enter, the diagonal is a sort of latent orientating form in the building. You enter always through a garden, through a courtyard, and have a kind of visual path to the entry of the building across the courtyard. And that was the west courtyard. This is the east courtyard. So Michael has developed a much more kind of green, almost residential kind of garden for the east side, which is a little bit less public, but it gives you, I think, that view back into the scholar courtyard, which is the third courtyard. You enter the building in a space we call the living room, which is both the entry to the Drawing Institute, but also a sort of living room for the entire campus, because it's, unlike many museums around the US, it doesn't have a lot of the things like auditoriums and restaurants and all those things. They're all in separate buildings. And so this needed to kind of function at two scales for the campus. So the galleries are to the south, and then this is the scholar courtyard to the north. The galleries are kind of very intimately scaled, so they're designed exactly for the collection that the Menil has. Of course, the collection will grow, but questions of proportion, scale, and light were a really important part of how we developed the project. This is according to our research, it's the first freestanding museum for drawings, at least in the US. There are a couple of drawing museums in Europe, but it was unprecedented in the way that as we did our research. So this is the scholar courtyard, a very different palette of trees. We had to modulate the light. This is a space for working, of course, for circulating, but it had a multifunctional kind of program demand on it. So Michael introduced a much more sort of intimately scaled, finer grain tree so that we get that sort of dappled light, which is quite different than the public courtyards. The heart of this building is the drawing room. It's the kind of center where scholars come to study drawings, and it's the one place where drawings are exposed to natural light in the building besides the lab. And so with very kind of simple means, scrims and blackout shades, we're able to create a kind of theater of natural light in the room centered around the study table, as well as these rails that allow us to produce raking light, which is a key part of the kind of technical study of drawings. And then as a kind of partner to that space is the conservation lab. The scholarly and technical study of drawings is always done both between the lab and the study center. And so these rooms are thought of as a pair, although they're scaled differently, and the atmosphere is a little bit different. And it's partnered with the conservation lab, which is to the north. These images, I think, reflect the kind of attempt we made to find this middle ground between a residential domestic scale and the institutional scale that reflects the fact that this is a museum building. So here's a view from the Twombly, so from the north looking south towards the first garden, where we try to both create an intimate space, a kind of hortus conclusus within this larger campus. And then this view directly from the west, where maybe in contrast to the south view, the building here feels quite small, almost really at a domestic scale, except for the kind of visibility of the living room, which connects both the east and the west courtyards. And I think this image captures an interest that we have, I think, that courses through all the work about this kind of twilight condition, a kind of in-betweenness. It's between building and landscape, light and shadow, inside and outside. It's sort of one of our obsessions, and this building has, it's tremendously challenging in terms of the demands of the environment for a museum for drawings, but I think we're really pleased that we're able to still have this kind of diaphanous quality of sort of lightness, despite a pretty ambitious structural system. For example, we're working with Guy Nortenson on this building, and this is half-inch plate steel, and right here, for example, it's a 60-foot span, so it's a sort of unsupported span of 60 feet that's a ribbed steel structure that forms the three courtyards. And just to close, let's see if we can get this guy to work. It's just a little short film that I think will give you some orientation to how the building sits on the campus. So this is from the north, from the Manil Collection porch, looking towards the Drawing Institute. The west entry. This wall is also plate steel, so this becomes kind of a uniform, coherent diaphragm. These are the undersides. This is the plate as well. It's the west courtyard and the living room. I'm looking into the galleries. So this is the Scholar Courtyard, which is both a kind of study area and a circulation space. And a split view with the gallery. These are the salons that encircle the drawing room, so more intimate gallery spaces that surround that space. And now we're back on the east side of the building. That's the south elevation, what we call the porch. The building is clad in a cedar. It's a cypress cedar that's essentially the same wood of the Manil Collection building, but obviously treated. It's a kind of natural oiled stain. So it is both, I think you can see, we both wanted to kind of echo the Renzo's building, but understand it in a kind of new way within the scale and sort of time of the Drawing Institute. So I think that's the end of my presentation. Thank you. The execution.
So, thank you, Sharon.
Yeah.
Fantastic lecture. So now we'll transition into the discussion where students from the core programs come up and ask questions. So
I just should get my flash drive back.
Sure.
Yeah.
I can just eject it.
Oh yeah, thanks. Oh yeah, I guess right. Yeah, it's on there.
I'm gonna raise the screen too.
Hi.
I'm the only one who shows up.
Oh, that'll be fun. Intimate. Thank you so much. Okay.
Awesome.
Okay. Hi. What's your name?
I'm Steven.
Hi, Stephen. Sharon.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Hi, I'm Cameron. Nice
Hi,
to meet
Cameron.
you.
Nice to meet you. So Stephen, Cameron.
Nice to meet you.
Hi. Jeff. Hi, Sharon. Nice to meet you.
why don't you guys start just by introducing yourselves?
Hello? Is it working? All right. I'm Stephen Victor. I am in the first year for the 3-year program of the graduate program here at Georgia Tech. And I did my undergraduate here as well, and many of the faculty members know me, so I'll just pass the microphone.
Hi, my name is Cameron Kane. I am a sophomore architecture major, and yeah.
Hi, my name is Renee Lopez. I'm part of the Master of Science in High Performance Building here in the Architecture Department.
Hi, I'm Jeff Collins. I'm a PhD student in design computation. So thank you very much for the beautiful work and presentation. I was noticing, especially in the beginning of the beginning work that you showed, very diverse aesthetic to each of the projects formally. Mm-hmm. But perhaps what might be thought of as the kind of consistent was this back and forth that you showed between the concept that you were describing and the graphic drawing and making of diagrams that was consistent through all of the projects. And in maybe a kind of different way than we're kind of are used to seeing. It's not really, while you were talking about structural and thermal, except for the last project, which kind of ruins my question, you weren't really showing those kind of diagrams that we're used to. You were showing very architectural, axonometric, constructed drawings. So, but I know that you're using the computer in a different way, and you're and doing these kind of analyses. So I was wondering if you could kind of share with us perhaps some ways that you are incorporating those kind of ideas into those what are traditional architectural representations.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is just a question of what you can show in a time like this. But I think we we work with a lot of. There's one particular team. I mean, to the question of thermal, let's say, and kind of environmental performance, we work with one particular team. They're called Loisis Ubaloidi, and they teach at Berkeley, and they're based in Northern California. And I think what we love about collaborating with Susan and George is that I think you can see from the work that there is a lot of sort of, fair amount of technological intelligence, but it's not something that we're interested in sort of wearing on our sleeve. That we want to use light in a way that, lessens loads and it makes a beautiful space, but it's not for us about showing the technology of how you monitor light. There's a kind of interest we have in a sort of primitive, like, look, no hands kind of thing that is important to us. I mean, I think it came out of, our early projects were very basic projects. I mean, we're beginning to work on bigger projects, but I think, as the projects become more sophisticated and, even the Drawing Institute building seems kind of, in a way, reduced, but it's incredibly challenging envelope. I mean, to create that environment for the drawings with the thin roof and all of that, it's been a real challenge. I think part of our work as architects is to sort of erase that. We don't want to show that effort. We want to create an atmosphere. We want to create a kind of experience, but we're not interested in demonstrating how we got there.
I guess my question will be more high performance related. You didn't show it either for the same reasons, and I understand that. In the design process, was there any influence from thermal or?
Yeah, so for example, as I mentioned, we're working with Guy Nordenson on the roof, and we have a whole host of consultants because that's plate steel, it's half-inch plate steel, it's hot, it's Texas. And so we had to do a lot of analysis, part of which was computer-driven and part of which is just empirical. I mean, we were building mock-ups, full-size mock-ups of the entire courtyards. We went through a whole selection process for our steel fabricator, and so everyone, we've done all our computer analysis, but they felt like that's how they wanted to do it. They wanted to validate that research by building it. They had the ability to build the shop and do that. So I think that's another, we're still working at a scale where we can do that, but we're real believers in mock-ups. We're real believers in working between the analog and the digital, because we just, that's how we see things, that's how we feel things. And so that's, yeah.
So one thing that I found very interesting was that you mentioned at the very beginning of your presentation that the work that you were doing was very much, not so much in the same genre of minimalist architecture. I did think that there were obviously some elements there that are present that are in minimalist or more modern architecture, like the precast concrete structures, metal plate facades and whatnot. But I wanted to know, I guess specifically to the works that you showed us today, what components or aspects you feel are evidence of your divergence from more typical or normal minimalist architecture?
Well, I think that there is, I mean, there's a diversity of the way we think about the integration of form and structure. So, I mean, don't want to sort of put minimalist architects, it's a lot of boxes to put people in, but I think that, I mean, Scott mentioned at the beginning, and I think I talked about the idea of what we talk about as a kind of coherence, that we actually like contradiction. I think a lot of minimalism in the most generic sense is about erasing. It's about abstraction. It's about purity. And I think we're not interested in that. I mean, we obviously, we have, very so-called clean, maybe less articulated in the conventional sense of detailing and stuff, spaces than many other architects that you guys see around. But I think it comes from a very different place. And I think when you're in those spaces, that sense of contradiction, that sense of heaviness and lightness, those qualities are physical things you can feel. And I think that's very different than what a kind of minimalist approach might take, which is to eradicate those things, eradicate contradictory qualities that for us give work life, make it oscillate, make it alive in a way. I think there's also, I would say, a kind of awkwardness in our work that's somehow inherent. We like ugly. We think about things being ugly and beautiful. I mean, there's, in the way that we don't want it to be pure. We like things that have imperfection in them. So we think that's what the world is, that's how we engage the world around us.
Thank you.
Now, one thing I noticed is that in our studios, we tend to focus a lot on site and how our buildings fit into the site and all that. And one of the projects I found to be most captivating was the first one that you showed with the huge slope with the and the ideas of massing and apertures. And how did you and your colleagues come to that kind of aesthetic situation for your projects, like going forward from there?
That's an interesting question, because I think we think, I think the work somehow, given the diversity of where we're working, we work hard to try to understand the places that we work in. It's hard because if you work around the world, you don't know some places more intimately than others. But I think that when I was talking about sort of place in the beginning, I think for us it's not merely a sort of contextual response. It's like, okay, the weather is this and the hillside is this. There's also a sort of aura around the projects that we try to create. In the case of the Hill House, that project that you're mentioning, the hillside as a type is kind of it was really prevalent around the time of, the case study movement, Neustadt, Schindler, all of those architects were addressing the problem. And so we started with a real intense analysis of those historical types. And from that, we began to understand sort of the trajectory historically of how the problem had been solved. And then we also had the sort of really immediate problems of our codes and our site. And so for us, it was a very, we don't normally work like that, where we sort of, in a little bit of a bottom-up way, input all the kind of parameters and create a figure. But in that particular project, we were both looking historically at a kind of way of approaching the problem as a type, which is the hillside house. And then we had this kind of the real facts of how to put a structure on a slope like that with this kind of extreme liquefaction in the ground. And so it was really about, I talked about this idea of approximation at the beginning, and for us it was about sort of aligning all of those seemingly disparate conditions and resolving itself to that figure. And so I think the context for us is larger than the specifics, but there is also a kind of real directness to solving the problem of getting that foundation wall to be built. By making it perpendicular to the slope, we were able to tie it back to piles at the street, and so there was a kind of tension model that was really efficient despite the complexity of pouring that wall. And so I think it's both, it always moves between a sort of will of the architect and a very direct approach to a problem of structure, primarily in that case. Probably the hardest part of that house was actually figuring out how to get the car in there. So there's like a 25-foot cantilever over the garage, because that was the only, from the street it looks like a one-story house, and so figuring out negotiating that slope was really a hard challenge, big challenge. Here we go. Start again.
Okay, so we can open it up. Any questions from the audience?
Mm-hmm.
houses, obviously, and then at the end of time there's more towards galleries. And I just wanted to know, all things being equal, which sort of projects do you prefer?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question because, it seems the typical aspiration is to kind of keep doing bigger projects, and that's, normally how it goes. And certainly working on bigger projects is a great opportunity. It's really an honor to work on those kinds of, in our case, cultural institutions. But we also, we still do work on house projects, and we work on really tiny projects too. I mean, normally they're with, special clients or somebody that, allows us to think about something that's meaningful. But I think we're constantly sort of going back to our work, not to sort of replicate it, but to mine the projects. That's why, we work in a lot of different mediums. We sometimes go back many years after a project is finished and produce another kind of model of it because it's something we're still thinking about. So we like shifting scale because I think it's fresh and it gives us it makes us think about problems in different ways, partly because of scale and complexity. So, I think at a certain point there's an economy in doing a big project that isn't there when you do a small project. So can't deny that, but we hope to try to keep that spirit of scale in our office. Mm-hmm, thank you.
How do you work with artists and architects on different levels? Would you say there's something inherent that the artist brings to the table in your practice?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it also maybe in answering that, it a little bit keys into some of your questions about sort of, how is technology, how are things present in the work? Because I think I said at the beginning, one of the things that we really are inspired by in working with artists is that there's always on the one hand, they engage a lot of issues in their work that are obviously different than we do as architects, but there's always at least for the artists that we really are interested in, there's always a very direct kind of engagement with the concrete problems of materiality and form and kind of aura of being around an object, a sculpture, an image. And I think we find that inspiring. While we engage technology, we realize the importance of advancements in technology to allow us to build things we could never build before. We also have a real affinity for the sort of primitive quality of making objects, making buildings, occupying space. And I think that's something that artists, not all of them, but a lot of them, that's how they think about the work they make and how it exists in the world. And so I think that's a connection that we have. Yeah.
Yes.
My cousin.
It's Scottish name.
Yes.
Yet, I think this last project we showed in Houston, is very, very attuned to this urban fabric.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, master plans have been studied, developed, teased out, incredible sort of pedigree of architects there and so on, trying to deal with that scale. When I look at the site plan that
Mm-hmm.
we were working with in Switzerland, or the one in China, it does not seem that urban design or architecture at the scale
Mm-hmm.
of the planning of a bigger scale property is really a part of the program. And so in those, what's your feeling about this? You like those group projects where a group are brought
Mm-hmm.
in a way, a kind of an exhibition
Right.
of
Right.
architecture. Yet what's so disappointing is how weak the site plans in those are. Even in the Swiss one, I suspect that you didn't say it this way, but I saw, to the extent that you were talking about the urban strategies of those interior courtyards
Mm-hmm.
and so on, it seemed to me almost to be a critique of what was going
Mm-hmm.
on in the larger,
Mm-hmm.
the larger setting. What's your thinking about urban design
Mm-hmm.
relative to what you own up to, which is an interest in the object quality of the architecture? How do those two?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Part of it is, for example, in the China project, with Weiwei, there was a certain despite it being master planned, we had no control over, we were incredibly limited, so we were designing an object. And I think we were making an attempt to think about the object that could have an impact, despite it being a singular and small object relative to the whole, that was more complex or address that kind of larger scale in its figure. I think that it's true that the collective projects, including Switzerland, I mean, there wasn't a lot of dialogue, but there was, I mean, that planning in terms of the footprints and plots was set and given to us. So, and I think it was just a matter of, I think a lot of the impetus for developers to bring in groups of architects is to kind of produce a kind of diversity just by simply having different authors. And we're doing a project in Miami now where it's all, the shell is done by, we're doing the envelope essentially, and then the buildings are, the shell and core stuff is done by a local architect. And the client is obsessed that none of us ever meet or know what any of the other person is doing, because they're trying to kind of create this slightly fake urbanism through that kind of diversity. So, I think the Manil project is it's again a relatively small building, but it has a pretty strong, as you say, a kind of pedigree of urbanism in the neighborhood of buildings. And part of it's just opportunity. I mean, we're trying to think about things, even like the UCLA project. It's a 65,000 square foot building on a plot. I mean, our goal was to not think of it as a heroic formal object, but to sort of atomize the buildings, the outside spaces, and try to think of it more like a village or a little city. So I think it's an aspiration we have, and we're hoping to have opportunities to think, to exercise that interest as we move forward in bigger scale projects. Yeah.
In the beginning of the design process, how do individuals at your firm represent their ideas early on, and how do you guys collaborate on those ideas?
Yeah, we work a lot in models, and I think you can see from the presentation that we typically start with our team producing an insane amount of models. I mean, the China House, we had 100 models. So it's just a way to just do it. And there's sort of no hierarchy to producing them. And the best ideas rise to the top. So I think it's a very unhierarchical process. And we do, I mean, you see some renderings in this our work now, but mostly those are done not by our own desire, but by needs of clients. So we normally, I mean, we're working in Rhino and things like that, but I think part of this idea of kind of displacing ideas, producing those collages, working in different mediums, collaborating with outsiders is about ways of testing the ideas as they go along. So I think we shift medium a lot to kind of interrupt what we're doing and sort of try to look at it from another perspective. Yeah.
On the question of medium, the first image that you showed, I thought it was a great diagram for the entire presentation because it captured the idea of flatness and aperture, right, which you could see through the whole work. So I'm curious how you think about material relative to that idea of flatness, because then you show cast and post concrete, you show stick frame, which has some sort of skim coat, you show stilt plate, right? So how do you guys approach the idea of materiality relative to flatness and aperture?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, for us, the early projects generally, I mean, not to lay it all on the money question, but a lot of times, for us, we're more interested in structure and aperture and, the way that light can animate our space and material. And given the resources we had, that's where we started. So it was just kind of an economy thing. I think that later projects, like in maybe the Manila is an example where it's still, I mean, it has, the buildings are clad in this very kind of highly engineered wood system. And so there's a real kind of beautiful materiality. It's almost like a kind of petrified wood. So I think it would be fair to say that we went to a lot of effort to kind of abstract the wood. So it still has a lot of material richness, but it doesn't look like wood that you would see on a typical wood building. And so I think there is a thing about materials in our work that we are trying, we think of them as really integral to the space of the buildings. It's not a kind of layer that's just on its own. It tries to really respond to volumetric qualities of the building. And so, and then with the structure, with the plate, I mean, that was kind of Guy's fault. But but we had, for us, it was trying to, by not revealing structure, showing ribs, showing frames, we believe that we really aspire to create a much more kind of abstract space where you're focusing on the landscape and not being obsessed with the structure of the building. So I think it's also a question of focus. It takes an incredible amount of engineering to produce that, but we want it to have that that kind of aura, that sort of ineffable quality. It's incredibly heavy, yet it feels light. I'm not thinking about, on the one hand, I can't imagine how that's working, but I don't really care because it's making the space. So it's been about kind of concealing the work that you're doing to produce another kind of effect. So material, I think, is coming in more, but it's something that we have a very measured approach about it.
Because I think about the James Turrell thing at Rice,
Yeah.
which has a very sort of
Right.
structure. And we had Eric Ritchie here a few weeks ago. He was talking about him doing all the
Oh, yeah.
architectural side. And that's all gypsum on an incredibly thin steel lattice, right? So it's kind of an interesting comparison, especially in Houston, to think about those two projects relative to each other.
Until the last question, you didn't mention abstraction or abstract. You talked a lot about the role of the primitive, your kind of uncomfortable relationship to minimalism, but you never mentioned abstraction. And the other thing that was interesting to me is that throughout the entire presentation, there was not one person in any of your spaces, photographs, renderings, anything. So I'm curious, so that's not an accident. So I'm just curious what your where you're going with that. In other words, I can see it as a kind of as a driving force behind your thinking, behind your methodology, behind the way you think about space, light, apertures, all the kind of components of architecture. But I'm curious how far you think you can take that before abstract becomes real. Like the wood also. In the animation, the first time you even got a glimpse of materiality was the wood, which is, again, your last question, you even abstracted the wood. So where are you going with that?
Well, and I think that there's it's not. I should use this. Yeah, I mean, I think that on the one hand, I would say that there's a real interest in a focus on space and a focus on structure as opposed to other things. So there's a kind of purity about that, let's say. But I also think, I mean, it's obviously it's an intentional choice not to include people in the pictures, and there's not a lot of furniture. That's just a way that we have chosen to talk about the work. But I would say that there's also a real interest in, we would use this word and have talked about it in conversations and in published works about, people have talked about the idea about generosity in our work. So that despite it seeming abstract or it seeming white or amaterial, that there is always an incredible attention to qualities of proportion and scale and things that make it incredibly forgiving as a kind of space to be in, to work in, to live in. And so, for example, for us, like all of these for the residential projects, for example, I mean, people, what's really important for us is that it doesn't have that sort of quality that one thing can be out of place and the house feels like it's completely disordered. So I think, I mean, I don't know if I'm really answering your question, but we were talking maybe a little bit before too about questions of control and scale, and that's shifting in our work. So I mean, this is it continues to be a kind of tweak for us, but I do think that there are qualities, the kind of atmospheric qualities of the spaces, the proportions of the spaces, the kind of generosity and multifunctional nature of how we think about making space doesn't preclude a lot of things that a hardcore minimalist abstract approach would preclude.
Any more questions? Well, I just want to end. I was thinking about the discussion that must have been had in the committee, the selection committee for the Medial project. And, you and probably Tatiana were sort of the underdogs in that competition. But I can imagine looking at your work, especially after seeing this presentation, and even though you didn't have a lot of large institutional buildings, there was a kind of confidence and consistency in the work from the very beginning, is that there was no ramp-up period to your career. You just kind of started with this clarity of thinking and clarity of work, which, if I was on the committee, I could also imagine, maybe it's a little bit of a chance, but it's probably a pretty safe bet, to give this to somebody like your firm. So anyway, that's just an observation, but it's just